Austin Walker is probably best known in the RPG space as the GM for the nearly 11-year-old Friends at the Table actual play podcast. But over the last decade, he served as an editor for Giant Bomb, the editor-in-chief for Waypoint, and the IP director for Possibility Space. Having made a living as a writer, games critic, and developer, it's not a surprise that his first foray into tabletop design would focus heavily on words. Walker's science fantasy game Realis, now in Ashcan form, has some of the most playfully written prose I've encountered, as well as some of the most deliberate mechanics. Its central resolution tool is the capital S sentence. Every character in the game has these sentences, each of which makes a statement about what the character always does. The alchemist always cures their patient. The pedagogue always shakes your faith. If the alchemist and the pedagogue were to come into narrative conflict, they would compare sentences, and the one which is most real would succeed. Most real would seem to be a pretty subjective measure, and so it is, which is why the game provides guidelines for determining which sentences win out. In this instance, whoever acts second would win, because as the very first page of the game states, this universe prizes passivity, except after wisdom gained. So the proud alchemist is shaken by the pedagogue's steady rhetoric. They cannot cure their patient. Realis' sentence system is more complicated than that, but I want to skip over the particulars of this mechanic to focus on its progression. You see, eventually, your character will lose a conflict 3 times with the same sentence. And once your character eats 3 failures with a sentence, it levels up. It realizes. And it's in this advancement that Realis bears its teeth. Because to level up a sentence, you add a condition. I always cure my patient when I have my tools. I always cure my patient when I have time for careful work. These limitations bring a sentence from a +0 to a +1, and will continue to do so up to +3, which is the highest level of reality a sentence can achieve. These systems are Realis' most interesting aspects, what differentiates it from the token games it builds upon. Because through the action of its resolution tools, and the way those tools advance, Realis sculpts a particular kind of character arc, one that can only result in a broken masterpiece. If you have even the slightest amount of interest in narrative media, you probably know what I mean when I talk about story structure. In recent years, the 3-act structure has arguably become the most popular way to conceptualize plot. You introduce a protagonist, you get that protagonist into increasingly complex situations, and right as things are looking most dire, they resolve their situation, for better or for worse. That's an extremely simple explanation for one of the most successful storytelling frameworks of the last few decades, but you get the picture. If you want to see a real granular breakdown, and potentially ruin the surprise of movies for the rest of your life, you can check out the Save the Cat technique, which lays out in even greater detail how the 3-act structure can be deployed. I think people have turned on 3-act structure in recent years. Saturation tends to breed boredom. But the lessons it teaches about the ways stories are supposed to work have been the foundation of my understanding of character arcs. For instance, if you look at Save the Cat, you'll note that the progression of the plot often centers around a catalyst and a debate. It's pretty similar to Joseph Campbell's Refusal of the Call, where the protagonist is confronted with a change to their situation, considers why they should become the main character, and then ultimately continues on with the story. And in a lot of writing advice, you'll get the note that the catalyst and debate both ought to be character-driven. Brutus doesn't have to kill Caesar, he decides that he has to in order to save the Republic. Katniss doesn't have to go to the Hunger Games, she volunteers in order to save her sister. As these stories progress, their characters continue to make choices that warp the plot around them. And in my limited experience trying to get fantasy novels published, I've seen many a literary agent give their would-be clients the advice to pursue that kind of character development, to make characters drive the plot instead of just react to it. It's the primacy of character-driven stories and 3-act structure that makes Realis' mechanics so interesting to me. The statement, "This universe prizes passivity," is both mechanically and fictionally true. The character that acts first in a scene, unless they have a high-level sentence, is the character that loses. Now, Realis gives you plenty of tools to get around this obstacle, but that this is the place the game starts suggests a few design intentions. Perhaps Walker wants Realis to be a GM-led game, with their NPCs and moons initiating challenges which the players must respond to. Walker spent over a decade of his life as a performing GM. That preference would make sense. That's not to say that GM-led games can't be character-driven, but sometimes theme and narrative momentum are easier to impose upon a game when the GM constantly presents challenges that players have no choice but to deal with. Perhaps Realis is intentionally confronting this save the cat, kick the dog style of storytelling. To mildly disagree with Quentin Smith over at Quinn's Quest, I think that TTRPGs as a medium should not necessarily attempt to replicate the storytelling procedures of films and novels. Yes, it's all very satisfying when you finally get to take that gun down from the mantelpiece, but I'm not sure that a traditional storytelling rule is one that is inherently desirable. Author Charlie Jane Anders released a newsletter in which he makes a point about 3-act structure that I can't stop thinking about. Basically, Anders says that if you conceptualize conflict as a series of struggles that become increasingly difficult until they lead to a final, decisive capital M moment, you're going to be woefully misinformed about how the world works. So, though I love a good third-act battle as much as the next guy, I think we should consider how tabletop RPGs can use their improvisational nature to seek out new rules and understandings of what a satisfying story can be. But if we're going to dwell so long on story structure, we should probably examine the way in which Realis sticks most closely to the mainstream. By having a character who acts first more than likely fail, Realis sets up players to expect that failure. It then rewards characters who have failed 3 times by allowing them to level up, making their failed sentence stronger in the process. This kind of design encourages experimentation, soothes the sting of a failed action. In many Powered by the Apocalypse games, we see a similar incentive, where players receive XP for failing a roll. Both PBTA games and Realis hew closer to standard storytelling practice when they ask players to seek failure. Frankly, stories without meaningful setbacks are kind of boring. If you know a character can never lose a fight, it's hard to get invested when they're facing mortal peril. Superman has his kryptonite, or has to protect Lois Lane, because otherwise he'd just give Lex Luthor a wedgie and that'd be the end of it. In Belonging Outside Belonging token games, where conflict resolution is not determined by an impartial die, players have to willingly throw themselves into difficult situations, using their weak moves to complicate the narrative intentionally. Realis achieves a similar effect by prizing passivity. Players know from the start that if they want to do something, they are putting themselves at risk of creating an interesting failure. Similarly, Realis' progression mechanics replicate traditional storytelling arcs when it comes to learning from failure. Often when a protagonist is dealt a loss, that loss teaches them something. That lesson later comes back to help them, and in a sense, they become more powerful because of their earlier defeat. This is kind of a bad example because Achilles famously does not survive the Iliad, but when Patroclus is slain by Hector, that is a loss for Achilles. That loss gives Achilles the motivation he needs to rejoin the war and ultimately defeat Hector. Realis borrows from this tradition. If you lose enough times, and you survive those losses, you grow from the experience. But perhaps this Iliad comparison works better than I think. I emailed Walker a few questions about Realis, and in his responses, I was surprised by a clarification he made. See, when I've said Realis is trying to do XYZ with its story structure, I've been conflating Walker's design intentions with the ideology of the game. But Walker was very clear. This game is a translation of the Word Rights ideology. The Word Rights are the in-fiction authors of Realis, a group of monastic scholars who, in this text, have described Thousand Moons as befits their own beliefs. So when I discuss how Realis is borrowing from both traditional storytelling modes as well as trying to push beyond them, I'm both describing the way I read the text, as well as expressing these Word Rights beliefs about the world. Describing Achilles' arc throughout the Iliad, how he grows and learns from his failures, falls in line with the way the Word Rights think the world operates. As Walker told me, the Word Rights love a world historical figure. In this light, it's very interesting that the Word Rights designed Realis' progression system, unlike similar systems in many other RPGs, to limit the character more than it expands them. Because Realis makes sentences add conditions, though those sentences become more powerful, the game narrows the situations in which they can be deployed. The Word Rights use metaphors of sculpting or whittling to refer to this process. But the thing about a statue is that it can only be so chiseled. At a certain point, if you want to continue carving, you're going to have to crack the marble itself. An aspect of Realis' character building I haven't yet mentioned is its inclusion of dreams. A dream is similar to a character motivation. It's their ultimate desire. It's the goal they work toward. So powerful are a character's dreams that if a player believes they've inched closer to achieving their dream, they can mark a sentence as if they'd failed using it, inching them closer to realization. However, a dream can also be used in place of a sentence when trying to overcome a conflict. This is very important, because using one's dream is the most powerful maneuver a character can make in the entire game. Dreams can even overcome a +3 sentence, or a +4 ephemera. This rule is, on its face, pretty much in line with traditional storytelling beats. I'm particularly thinking of shonen anime when I say this, but the invocation of a main character's primary motivation is often one of those tools writers use to help them achieve some sort of victory. Naruto believing it into being the Hokage is my touchstone, but I'm also thinking a lot about sports stories. Sure, training and team bonding is a big part of that, but at the end of the day, it's the team's personal desire that allows them to play hard enough, to suffer long enough, to win. However, Realis is not just interested in completion of that character arc, but has a sick desire to see what comes after the denouement. And in order for that desire to come to fruition, it asks players what happens after one's dream is spent. Quote, "You can spend your dream at any time, even on a task totally unrelated to your dream's content." This rule directly contradicts the game's advice about when to retire your character, which is to say, soon after they accomplish their dream. This is a delicious and cruel tension in Realis, one which aligns with Walker's work in Friends at the Table, putting players in difficult situations. What happens when a character is facing down an opponent much stronger than them, in a scenario where failure will mean suffering or destruction? Well, you could always spend your dream, and in the process, behead your character's narrative arc before its climax. Your characters will survive their deadly encounter, but in the process become rudderless ships. Quote, "Once you have spent your dream, you cannot write another one." It's kind of an incredible threat to put on the table from the jump. Traditional RPGs might have you spend hours grinding XP and collecting magic items before you unlock your ultimate ability. But in Realis, you begin play with the magic bullet already in the chamber. When a character can simply press a big red button to win at any time, it creates an interesting play dynamic. NPCs don't have access to dreams, so you know that no matter how bad things get, you can always choose to win a scenario, once. And similarly, you know that if you ever come into conflict with a fellow player character, both of you are sitting on a tool that could prove deadly if you were both to bring it to bear against each other. Because Realis is so explicitly a collaborative storytelling game, the text is very careful about player versus player conflict. However, maybe the most interesting line in all of Realis crops up when Walker considers the worst-case PvP scenario. Should two-player characters pit their dreams against one another, Realis has prepared a brutal contingency. If both players spend their dream, quote, "Neither will get their intention, both dreams will be crossed off, and both actors will leave the conflict spiritually spent." This is already a delightfully sad rule, but what gets me is this little addendum right beneath it, written in the same disintegrating font as the game uses for the cursed moon of Yazarin. "Such clashes are succor for the parasitic physics of Realis itself." The implications of this segment are bone-shakingly profound, to me. I adore the notion that when two dreams are unleashed upon each other, their expenditure ruins both dreamers. Imagine how this might play out at the table. If your friend announces their desire to burn their dream against you, you're faced with a choice. You know that they very badly want to achieve success in whatever conflict you're facing, so much so that they're using this conflict as the peak of their character's strength. Or worse, that they're forgoing their character's whole motivation in order to come out on top. You already know the stakes are as high as they can be, from a character development standpoint. You could cede this ground, except that you've lost this battle. Or, you could decide to be a spoiler, and ruin everyone's day. I think Realis, in this spirit, is much more about building characters to find those intense emotional struggles. It's not including this rule so you can be a dick to your fellow players. Especially when you consider that addendum. Such clashes are succor for the parasitic physics of Realis itself. When I read this game, I couldn't get past the idea that Realis is powered by the parasitic physics of dying dreams, that this is a game about seeking out suffering as characters are pared down by the cruel blade of narrative. But in his email, Walker disagreed with my read. To Walker, this rule about nullifying dreams serves a double purpose. One, it disincentivizes players from going all in a moment of passion at the table. But two, and more interesting to me, it reflects the word right's acceptance of a fact of the world. Though they might love a world historical figure, they must acknowledge that no amount of believing it is sufficient to achieve one's dream. Material reality always gets in the way. In the Realis Ashcan, Walker gives players a series of moons, a sample of the 1,000 that orbit the planet. There's technically 4, but if you read the page on Yazarin, the 7th moon, you'll find its entry curiously sparse. The word rights couldn't bear to lay its details out in aggregate. Instead, they scattered them throughout the text. It's trivially easy to find the secret of this cursed moon. Control F is a YouTuber's best friend. But in assembling the story of Yazarin, one finds a curious detail, one that I feel strongly resonates with Realis' theme of conflict-powered story. In the game's play examples, Walker lays out the tale of an expedition to Yazarin, and the dreadful consequences that follow. What the crew of the Panta Ray discovers on Yazarin's surface is an altar that exudes the undoing word. It's hard to say precisely what the undoing word is, but the text describes it as having entropic power, and that a fatalist cult has cropped up around it. The goal of the fatalists is simple: bring Realis to oblivion. They don't know what will happen when they use the word to end the world, but they do believe that whatever happens afterwards is better than what is happening now. Walker, like me, is an ex-Catholic, and so when I read that the fatalists believe that all of Realis is a dread purgatory, my ears do perk up a bit. In Catholicism, purgatory is a realm in between earth and heaven, a place where your salvation is assured, so long as you suffer adequately to purge your sins. And in that reading, I think it's easy to see why the fatalists want to end Realis. Actually, now that I think about it, the font used to describe Yazarin is the same font which describes the nature of Realis as being powered by parasitic physics. It's entirely possible to read that belief as an addition of the fatalists to the word rights text, slipping their ideology into the narrative of the book itself. But the point is, there are people on Realis who see through the game's physics, who understand that, indeed, this is a world powered by conflict, and seek to escape it. And somewhat ironically, in their pursuit of a better world to come, they always drive Realis closer to crisis. I lay out this whole section about the fatalists in Yazarin to underscore the fact that Realis, or at least its in-world authors, are clearly interested in the process of being shaped by one's failures. The philosophy of sculpting characters through their experience is all throughout the book, but I think Walker's interview with Rascal News lays out this design choice most clearly. At the end of a Realis character's progression, they're not a level 20 superhuman, they're just tired. Perhaps the most gut-wrenching aspect of the game is its retirement rule. When a +3 sentence reaches 3 failures, it does not continue sharpening, but instead reverts to its +0 format, with one final condition: a statement that this is how things used to be for you. Instead of, when I issue a challenge underneath the light of the moons, I am always unstoppable against Empest warriors, your sentence simply becomes, I was always unstoppable. This final limitation really affects me. In the Rascal interview, Walker himself calls attention to its parallels with aging, how your body starts to weaken so early on in life, how the people you once loved are just disused contacts in your phone. As someone who ran a marathon at 18 and can no longer run a mile, it's a sobering thought. I've certainly noticed how I've gotten better at specific things, but with every year that passes, my capacity for broad experience evaporates. I simply cannot do it all anymore. Life whittles away the excess until only fine details remain. But at the same time, as I try to sculpt the story of my own life, I see how Realis' progression mechanics resist the mold of 3-act structure. When a story comes to its climax, the ending follows soon after, the tale ceases to be told. When a sentence is retired in Realis, that is not the end. Your player can continue to use it, just as a +0 sentence. It can't get stronger, you can't accomplish a whole lot with it, but you still have that knowledge in the back of your mind, even if your body cannot wield it with your old strength. There is both a sense of melancholy in not being at your peak, but also a comfort, I think, in knowing that even after you've hit your limit, you can still draw from that well of experience. That Realis gives you the ability to persist in your weakness is notable. When King Arthur is wounded by Mordred, he doesn't get to chill on the throne, his story just ends. But when your Realis character is hanging on by a thread, with only one +3 sentence remaining, the rest locked at a permanent +0, I think you get a fascinating character, a fractured masterpiece. You could even have expended your dream, perhaps on a battle you thought meant everything. But now, with the wisdom of hindsight, you recognize was only the hubris that haunts the young. That is not to say that a Realis character must hang on until they're a ragged bundle of sinew and regret. As Walker said in his email, Realis is a game where your characters can achieve their dream and retire peacefully. We should all be so lucky. but that Realis can get to a stage where you're a brittle knife, liable to break but still sharp enough to kill, speaks to an appreciation of vulnerability. Perhaps, as Avery Alder and John Harper say, a character can be a stolen car, driven past the speed limit and shattered in an inevitable crash. But Realis, despite being fueled by the physics of conflict, still cares to find out where the chassis might land. There's a false quote attributed to Michelangelo. One day, the great artist was approached by an admirer who asked him how he was able to sculpt the work of art as profound as the David. And Michelangelo's cheeky reply was, "It was easy. You just chip away all of the stone that does not look like David." Realis, with all its allusions to sculpture, brings me back to this story, because as a text, it is not actually concerned with the statue itself. The entirety of Realis' gameplay is about the easy part, about each strike of the chisel that carves facets into your character-shaped blank slate. There's no statue waiting in the stone to be revealed. There is only the steady rhythm of the knife as it whittles the block, cutting deeper with each word. And then, when your masterpiece is finished, you keep cutting. But Nike of Samothrace is no less victorious without her head. Shelley's trunkless legs of stone do not diminish the King of Kings' former glory. Perhaps one day nothing will remain of Realis' blue landscape but lone and level sand. It doesn't matter. The 1,000 moons will be littered with 10,000 broken statues, and each of them will have been a marvel. Thank you to everybody for watching. I really appreciate anyone who takes the time to see what I'm saying about tabletop games. The names of the people who make these videos possible are scrolling by right now. If you want to become one of the people who helps me keep the channel going, you can join my Patreon, where members will get access to all my games, as well as the option to vote on a special video for the end of the year. That voting is probably done by the time this video comes out, but, better luck next time, I guess. My background picture is Liquefied Image by Adrian on Unsplash. My profile picture is by Eater Outsider on Tumblr. If you want to find more of my work, I'm at AAVoit on Blue Sky, Monster Factory Fanfic on Tumblr, but my main site is aavoit.com, where I talk about games and writing. I also do a podcast, Mortified the Friendship Quest, where me and my friend Layla do critical media analysis. We just talked about the SS Rajamouli movie RRR, which is a fun anti-colonial romp. I think it was a really, really fun conversation, so please go ahead and check that out. Thank you as always for watching. It's been a really busy month for me, so I suspect that my next video will be similarly delayed to this one. Hopefully in the latter half of the year I will get back into the swing of things. But until next time, I'll see ya.